Music. Good afternoon on the air, the big game St. Petersburg II. Summit Russia-Africa opened today. 49 delegations from 54 African countries arrived and 17 are represented at the level of heads of state governments. Vladimir Putin has already spoken at the plenary session and addressing the participants. He said that in our country you stay in a circle of friends and like-minded people. Well, he also made a lot of important statements that we will discuss in detail today, including, of course, food security, which is a burning issue for African countries. And listen to what the president said in response to this. Our country is able to replace Ukrainian grain both commercially and in the form of gratuitous assistance to the most needy countries in Africa. Moreover, we again expect a record harvest this year.
Чтобы быть конкретным, добавлю, скажу, мы будем готовы уже в ближайшие месяцы, в ближайшие 3-4 месяца безвозмездно предоставить Буркина-Фасо, Зимбабве, Мали, Сомали, Центральноафриканской Республики, Эритреи.
Minus 50,000 tons of grain, we will provide free delivery of these products to the consumer. This is really called global public goods, and this is the role that Russia plays in the emerging multipolar world. Before Vladimir Putin held bilateral negotiations with the President of the African Union. This presidency is rotated in this organization. Now in it is chaired by the Union of the Comorian Islands, and after the plenary, Vladimir Putin met with the main Mozambicans of Burundi, and even today bilateral talks with the leaders of Zimbabwe and Uganda are planned. And, by the way, these countries, with the exception of the Comoros, have never voted for a single anti-Russian resolution in the United Nations. There are 19 nations, and all such countries in Africa, and among them, in addition to those already mentioned, are strategic partners of the Republic of South Africa and Algeria, as well as Burkina Faso, Guinea, Cameroon, the Republic of the Congo, Raspberry, Namibia, Sudan, Tanzania, the Central African Republic, Equatorial Guinea, Swane and EFIME, with the Prime Minister, which Vladimir Putin met yesterday. Well, yesterday he also held talks with the President of Egypt, another strategic partner of Russia in Africa. Meanwhile, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu today met in Pyongyang with the leader of the DPRK, Kim Jong-un, discussed issues of global and regional security, sent a joint big hello to South Korea, which joined the anti-American to the anti-Russian policy of the United States. Well, in the meantime, the special operation continues the night before Russia launched another massive missile attack on targets on the territory of Ukraine. Well, Kiev, apparently, succumbed to pressure from the West, which had been exerting on it all the last days, and sharply intensified its offensive in the south, in the southeast of Ukraine. All the mainstream Western media are writing about this today. The West demanded reserves for it into battle. Well, we will talk about what is happening on the fronts now with our traditional military observer Boris Rosen. Boris Alexandrovich, good afternoon. So what is happening? One really empty. West had been putting pressure on the Zelensky regime for several weeks, demanding results from it. Because after all, July is already ending. Something significant Ukraine has not reached. Some of the reserves have already been squandered during the failed July offensive. Now they are really starting a new offensive. That is, they started that. This is not an offensive that was before. In fact, their loan have disappeared now due to the fact that they have left. They're trying to achieve a result in order to show some results somewhere by the end of September. Therefore, new brigades are introduced in a battle that previously did not differ on the first line. They are already suffering losses. Well, so far, in principle, they have not reached any significant status. If you look along the front line in the area of work on the second day of the enemy's attacks, quite successfully beat off the lion's share of the loss of equipment there in recent days. Several tanks have been destroyed. Leopard Polish modernized tank 72, BMP Bradley well, and a lot of various armored engineering vehicles and the like. Despite the losses, the enemy could not advance. Therefore, the offensive stalled here, but through the attacks they will continue. So, for the time of the Enemy's tactical successes, he was able to wedge into our defenses in the area of the village of Staromersko. In the village, fighting continues now. There's also a roll-on too. Eurozhye, including the use of parts that I previously were in reserve, that is, well, again, we see all the same promotion points where he cannot achieve a result in June. They now, at the end of July, began August, they will again try to break through, but there are not so many forces for long-term offensive operations of the enemy, tentatively enough for 3 to 4 weeks, then they will start to fizzle out simply because the bulk of the reserves are actually being used right now, and there will be especially nothing to cut further. Therefore, we need to sort of hold on. We grind quite large enemy formations here. This means that the situation is stable in the depression. Small clashes continue there, pulling the enemy, our troops regularly cover the right bank of the Dnieper, inflicting significant losses on the enemy in the Obliga direction. The situation as a whole remains unchanged. The main battles are still going on in the Krasnogorovka area to the west-southwest. Our troops continue to try to press the enemy in order to create a threat of an operational encirclement, 1.5 attack in order to try to remove this threat. Well, in fact, here it is in this scenario that fierce battles for ticking continue to develop in the Artyomovsky direction, but the enemy, despite the failure of the existing days, continues to attempt to break into the village and gain a foothold. Ours are fighting back while the situation here is balancing on both sides. They are being introduced into any additional reserves, but the enemy is rolling into Kurdimovka and Andriivka. Here our troops are also holding the defense. It is important to note that today Klishchivka is located under our control. The enemy's statement to take into Kiev, they do not correspond to reality, and also the enemy today tried to attack northwest of the Artyomov attack. They were successfully repelled on the Sevsky ledge. Positional battles in the area of the disputed Belagorovka, the attacks of the opponents in the direction of Solidarity, were also successfully reflected in the Svatov direction. Ours the troops are in full possession of the initiative and continue the offensive about 1 to 2 kilometers a day. We are advancing in the direction of Oskol and occupying small villages that are located there in the Lesnoy Massif. We are advancing towards Borovair from the Tomahovka and in the Torsky area, the Japanese enemy has so far been able to stop our offensive, but north of these points, until he completely holds the defense, the enemy cannot have a length back to the west. So in addition to your note that this offensive confuses the enemy's plans and forces him to throw here the reserve that he planned to use in the Zaporozhye and Artemovsk region, we are continuing the offensive in the Kupiansk direction. Here we are fighting to consolidate the areas in the Lesnoy Massif near the Blue River and in the Two River area. We also advanced a little in the Massitovka area. The enemy is also transferring additional reserves here. In total, during missile strikes, 3 enemy airfields were hit just in western Ukraine from which British anti-aircraft missiles were launched. Well, the enemy naturally downplays these strikes in every possible way later, but from what is known from Ukrainian sources on the ground, the damage was quite serious and the enemy's air defense could not fight its okay with our hypersonic missiles that we used for these strikes. Thank you very much, Boris Alexandrovich, for such a voluminous complex picture. Keep us informed well. I must say that among the Western mainstream media, there is no consensus on what is happening now. Everyone says that yes, the Kiev regime has sharply activated offensive operations, planted fresh reserves, but what is behind this? The New York Times and the publication of the politician write unambiguously that the main blow is finally taking place, which the West has been seeking for the past few days, and thousands of reinforcements trained in the West and equipped with Western equipment are being pulled up and they are moving forward here, the Washington Post takes a much more cautious position. It seems to me a much smarter position, because they do not exclude that we can talk about what they call the formative operations. The preliminary operation and the main direction of the strike is still ahead. And why does it seem to me that the Western Post took a wiser position? Because that the results of what the Kiev regime is doing now are already known. And Vladimir Putin said about these results today on the sidelines of the summit.
Что касается последних дней, то да, действительно, мы подтверждаем, что боевые действия активизированы и существенным образом. Основные боестолкновения проходили на направлении, как говорят на Западе,
Strike in the Zaporozhye direction, without any exaggeration, I can say that our soldiers and officers demonstrated the best examples of mass heroism. The enemy used a large numbers of armored vehicles, 50 units, of which 39 units, including 26 tanks and 13 armored vehicles, were destroyed in any of the areas more than a collision. The enemy was successful, didn't have all attempts at a counteroffensive stop there. Enemy pushed back with heavy losses, except for military equipment, of course. The enemy has very large losses of personnel, over 200 people. Unfortunately, we didn't do without losses, but the difference is colossal, at times more than 10 times. We have less than the enemy. Ivan Pavlovich, well, in the light of what the President said, do you agree that Washington took a wiser position and, just in case, did not say that this was the main blow, because if it failed, it would be necessary to somehow explain this if this was not the main blow. Forming the operation well, okay here. Indeed, this is just a collision in the information field, because on the battlefield everything is quite obvious. To admit that really serious Ukrainian forces carried out a rather large-scale operation in the Zaporozhye direction and were rebuffed. There, up to 3 tank battalions participated. This is about 90 tanks, respectively, although again, it was not proportionate that there was a huge amount of infantry, which, naturally, as usual, was thrown into the assault. The fact that all this was repulsed is just this, the collision between the Washington Post and the New York Times reflects what is first of all what sources, yes, who to whom, what and others, and they referred to anonymous representatives of the Pentagon, yes, but here it is necessary to make an adjustment that when the Washington Post writes this, this also means that this opinion from the Pentagon was corrected by the opinion from the White House. For sure, but the essence is precisely in this and in the fact that, the general impression is invested. Not that, yes, I mean the West, not that the Ukrainian and the Ukrainian counternorts are running out of steam, this is not the point, but one gets the impression there is a Leopard Patriot now. Small Hornets have appeared. These here means that their UAVs, for some reason, have also suddenly declared some kind of miracle weapon. There is still, maybe there will be F-16, it's on when. Should we give an assessment of what is happening new? Nothing is impossible to come up with because Bild made just a well-known article, referring to the opinion of the German military that, in general, all this offensive, the whole pair of this offensive goes off the whistle. This is so well. The president, who has basic data about what is happening on the battlefield, has publicly confirmed all this. Now it's interesting. What articles will be after that? What to? Right next is a question, well, now we'll ask Andrei Andreevich what will happen next because, well, it's obvious that the Zapor is now trying with all its might to demonstrate some kind of progress, some kind of success in order to put Russia at the negotiating table and impose on it a disadvantageous Russia with some kind of settlement, even by freezing if this does not work out. Already unprofitable for the West, either to do what the Americans call kicking a tin can in front of them and further, that is, despite the lack of victory, despite the lack of success, continue in the policy that they are pursuing now to support the Kiev regime afloat, to support our military operations Because they believe that the costs of admitting their failure have failed. The entire strategy in general, and attempts to put Russia in a strategic position will be more than the support they receive from maintaining the current status quo. What will the Biden administration do, especially on the eve of the elections? I believe that the current offensive, although it is significant for the Ukrainian side, in American domestic politics, however, its importance should not be overestimated. For a long time I watched the Americans cover their own adventure in Afghanistan and Iraq, and every quarter there was some kind of general story, the general line that was presented to the public as a kind of success story. The intrigue was the development of this plot. There was a certain narrative that stood behind the victorious general having a company plan, and gradually this story faded away. Sometimes it didn't even get any kind of conclusion. Some other story appeared, and the American public has been watching Ukrainian actions for a long time. For a month they presented with a version about the fact that there's a victorious offensive that should end almost to take the Crimea, and unless you prevent it, you need to give some new impetus to update a few characters, show a slightly different narrative, and try to roll this scarf again. It is clear that this is the tactic that the Americans have chosen to rely mainly on information events and not events on Earth. It has a very significant drawback when information events are not supported by real achievements on Earth. It immediately becomes obvious that this is such a soap bubble. An empty event is worth nothing behind it. It seems to me that the West, in any case, regardless of even the hostilities in Ukraine, will continue the hybrid war with regard to Russia. It simply can be other means, and an important part of this hybrid war is the pressure that the West is exerting on the countries of the world majority, including Africa, and after all, the West has put enormous pressure on African countries so that they do not go to the summit in St. Petersburg. Nothing happened because what it seems to me that African countries understand here, and actually, the difference between the Russian approach and the Western approach. The Russian approach lies in the fact that Russia and Africa are equal partners in the framework of a multipolar world, and today, just at a meeting with the leaders of the African Union, the Comoros and the Commission of the African Union, the President said that Russia is ready to worldwide contribute to strengthening the sovereignty of African states to help Africa become one of the key partners in the new system of a multipolar world order. This is the Russian approach, and the Western approach, on the one hand, puts pressure on Africa so that they do not cooperate with Russia in any case, but on the other hand, they even interfere with the provision of humanitarian aid to Africa, because, as the President has already stated, at the plenary session, out of the 262,000 tons of fertilizers that are blocked in European ports, it was possible to send all the shipments to Mali and Kenya. The rest remained in the hands of the Europeans, despite the fact that we are talking about purely humanitarian aid, which turns out to be free of charge. Yes, and the West is constantly forcing African countries to make a choice. You are either with us or with Russia. Whoever is not with us is against us. President Bush Jr. Yes, Russia speaks to the countries of the world majority for equal partnership. Russia does not call on African countries to refuse cooperation between the United States and the European Union, and so on. And it seems to me that African countries understand this, and I will give an example of this understanding, and a statement from an article in the publication of a member politician Kenyas of the Parliament of the Congo, Jeremus Yusupa. Listen. Each superpower is trying in various ways to attract the state of Asia and Africa to its side. However, unlike the last century, it is not so easy to put these countries before a choice. Yes, they don't need it. Russia understands this, but the West doesn't. Your reaction to such statements? You know, Russia this year presented its new concept of foreign policy to the world. Africa occupies a worthy place there, and in general Africa, Russia does not belong to the Western world, and African countries, they perfectly understand the difference in communication. What they Here from the West is a conversation from above down, and what Russia offers, this is equal partnership. This is respect for the sovereignty of African countries. What is the problem? African countries are a little afraid if they see that the unipolar world is changing, the multipolar world is leaving. But you need to wait a bit. As soon as the non-Western countries see the force even more so, distinct interface China, Russia, other southern powers, I think that the world will begin to change even more rapidly, and what we are now seeing at this forum is one of the manifestations, and what surprised me is the different coverage of these events. If the West is trying, I read the American media, there are British they just want to emphasize, look how little the leaders of African countries have come, yes, by doing so. They want to show something, but in fact, this is not so. This is a constant distortion of reality. This is an attempt, so to speak, to distort the facts, how the world seems to be. Changing in the fact that the second summit is already, and by the way, these themselves you are holding not. Only Russia is holding, in the United States of America, China is such a well practice. Yes, the world, but if you compare the tone, yes, what we see with the participation of the United States is completely different. This is how Americans meet with African countries, with Latin American countries, yes. Anyway, this is just that conversation, I said, from top to bottom in these countries. Feel it, Andrei Andreevich. Hear that. West is putting pressure on the countries of the world majority, so they do not cooperate with Russia and China. Don't you think that the result is the opposite? The more the West wages a hybrid war against Russia, the more the West at the same time shows a policy of double standards. The attitude of all other topics is more dynamically shown by this world majority, an example and personification of which is the current summit Russia-Africa. Dmitry, you're absolutely right. As a Western leader, it is difficult now to put yourself in the place of African leaders and understand what an African country cares about. Russian Western contradictions due to some European, Eastern of a European country, why this particular question should become a key one for an African country in the 21st century. They do not understand this is a very sensible question to which there is no obvious answer, and therefore they are very sober on the basis of pragmatism and in their own interests. Now analyze the situation. Often acts are parachuristic, but understand that the center world gravity is shifting from west to east, and of course they listen more to those countries that are capable of empathy, a sober analysis of the interests of African countries, and give them what they need without pressure. I completely agree with you, and we will talk in more detail about the promising areas of the Russian African partnership after a small advertisement. Music. On the air, the big game is Africa, many call Asia of the 21st century, and today Vladimir Putin also spoke in detail about the prospects for Africa in the global economy, especially considering their demographic potential. This is one of the young, fast-growing continents, and about the prospects for trade and economic cooperation between Russia and Africa. Here, listen to what he said. The potential of Africa is obvious to everyone, so the average annual GDP growth rate of the continent over the past 20 years is 44.5% per year, exceeds the global population, is approaching 1.5 billion people, is growing faster than anywhere in the world. It is characteristic that the growth of the middle class that forms the main demand for modern goods and services overtakes similar indicators in most regions of the world. I note that last year, the Russian-African trade turnover reached $18 billion. We altogether, in the foreseeable future, more radically increase trade, and, by the way, at the same time, only in the first half of this year, the volume of export-import operations with the countries of Africa has grown by more than a third. and Ekaterina Yakovlevna, in the field of economics, what Russia can give Africa and what Africa can give Russia. This is a good, very interesting question. President put the emphasis very correctly in terms of the resource that this region has. Indeed, this is a colossal region, colossal consumer potential, colossal potential for further development of those natural resources that are on the territory of the country, and not even those resources that we hear about in terms of precious metals or some other diamonds, and so on. A number of African countries have huge untapped reserves rare earth metals, and now these countries, including, by the way, among them there are a number of those states that he listed. Among the African countries that have never voted for a single anti-Russian initiative, and just these states are now the arena of the investment struggle for access to these resources. From this point of view, in my opinion, Russia has huge opportunities in the medium-long term for Nara of its investment presence on the African continent to obtain and develop these mineral deposits, for the implementation of joint mining projects, for some kind of joint technological initiatives, and this is mutual beneficial cooperation, that is, this technological development of resource reserves. The second moment is, of course, financially in the conditions of African countries quite seriously dependent on foreign capital from the capital of European countries. This is American capital in the context of a massive tightening of monetary policy. The objective question arises of how these states will follow will be refinanced, where they will cover growing rates and draw financial resources for their own economic growth from the usual financial jurisdictions. It becomes more and more difficult, respectively. It is obvious that African countries from a financial point of view are beginning to turn towards other players, primarily large players in the global south, in order to gain access to more. They look to China for cheap credit resources. In the future, this is also a field for interaction with Russia. It is very important to consider the current summit not only as a separate such important, naturally a strategic political event, but also as a major event on the eve of the future BRICS summit, which will be in a month. Since they were invited 54 of the states of the African continent, that is, in fact, it will be a kind of continuation of this rhetoric. The start will be given at the current summit in St. Petersburg, and the main points of discussion will be finance, by chance. Vladimir Putin met with the new president of the new development bank, BRICS, the day before. This is Dilma Rousseff, the former president of Brazil, because indeed BRICS is becoming extremely important, an increasingly influential tool, firstly, global development, and secondly, in the context of the entire African process, in the context of the Russia Summit Africa, on the one hand, the upcoming BRICS Summit. On the other hand, the new BRICS Bank plays a huge role, and this, in fact, was also stressed by the president yesterday, and Dilma Rousseff spoke about this, about how the new development bank implements its policy on the African continent. A number of African countries have already become, yes, well, you touched on the aspect of competition. For Africa, it's really a sin to hide, and Africa is not only an increasingly influential subject of international relations, but there is a big struggle for it, and other countries that also hold their summits with Africa participate in this struggle. This is the United States, European Union, China, India, Turkey. Not everyone is trying to increase their influence in Africa, but Russia has its own competitive advantages, and now we have a unique opportunity to communicate with a person who is right at the Russia-Africa Summit in St. Middle Eastern and African Studies of the Institute of International Studies MGIMOA, and co-author of a recent Valdai report on Russian-African relations, Laura Evgenia. So here is the competitive advantage of Russia relative to other world centers of power that are fighting for influence in Africa. Colleagues, good afternoon. I think that there are probably 4 factors that need to be mentioned. The uniqueness of Russia. We need to talk about the Soviet legacy. After all, the Russian partnership has passed the test of time, and it seems to me that after all, Russia is not returning to Africa. She has always been with her since the Soviet period, when significant political, economic, financial, military technical assistance was provided to our African partners and friends. Secondly, we support our own development agenda of our African colleagues. This is psychologically very important for them. They have their own development institutions. We are talking about the African Union. Philo video of African solutions for African problems. Thirdly, it is important to talk about that absence of political pressure. We have already talked a little about this today, and this is especially relevant against the backdrop of the pressure under which our African friends found themselves literally writing and dissuaded them from coming to the summit. I think that in this context, it is very important for them to feel that we respect their sovereignty, that they have freedom of choice, freedom of speech, and we really are. They're great allies in this regard, and I would like to conclude by the fact that we support the desire of African countries to take an active part in international affairs. Speech today was about supporting the initiative to enter the group of 20, and what is most pleasant is most likely already this year at the Indian summit. We mean more than 20 in India at the summit, so this is a great achievement that is possible thanks to the efforts of Russia. Of course, Russia is just promoting the subjectivity of everything, great subjectivity of Africa. I would like to emphasize that if some other, primarily Western centers of power, they pursue a policy of divide and rule, they have their favorites, let's say, on the African continent, and they impose sanctions and other restrictive measures against others, then Russia, on the contrary, promotes consolidation and integration in Africa. Because, unlike the West, Russia is interested in Africa growing stronger so that Africa really becomes a powerful center of a multipolar world. Yes, this is absolutely in tune with the Russian approach to international relations, and building a fair world order was once again discussed this week in St. Petersburg. I saw that you were there, and you are the co-author of the chapter of the section of this report on recommendations on how to actually make this and the summit more successful. That the atmosphere here today is positive and very constructive, and we have been moving towards this moment for 4 years, despite external circumstances that have complicated our path to the summit. We are here. I think that this is still a great achievement for Russia and Africa, so this must be recognized and celebrated. I will try to tell about my expectations through the prism of the recommendations that you mentioned first. I mentioned the importance of working with different target groups within this format. They themselves are a reference point that mobilizes business non-educational institutions at the same time as the state structure, and so on, both from the Russian side and from African, and we see it here that really many very active conversations are going on, discussions, negotiations, and this is a very important part of probably different groups that are present, that the conversations are very specific, and the philosophy for the next one is that there should not be a single superfluous person in a negotiation room, that I deal with this. Secondly, the summit is a showcase for the opinion of our African friends, partners and colleagues. It is very important for us to listen, especially given the wide group of our guests here at the summit. This will allow us to determine the tracks of work as clearly as possible in the context of the desire for more requests and so on. As for My recommendations to develop a smart declaration, I am very happy to report that most likely, as a result, they themselves will adopt a working document. It is a roadmap up to 26 years old. This is very important because it also allows us to specify the tracks that work, and I will probably conclude by saying that it is very important to communicate as efficiently and effectively as possible. This is also a great importance of this summit, that this is a place where Russia can broadcast our vision without an intermediary, without distortion, and so that our African partners really hear us. I think that there are very lively, heated discussions here at the summit. Direct communication. Work. Thank you very much, Laura Evgenievna. I congratulate you on the fact that you were able to actually observe and take part in this summit from the inside, and we are all looking forward to the final documents and declarations, and that you absolutely correctly emphasized the plan for further work until 2026 well. Returning to the sectoral linear areas of Russian-African cooperation, the President also singled out energy as an area that is definitely needed for both African countries and Russia, where Russia has just one more competitive advantage compared to our rivals/partners. Let's hear what the President said on this matter. We are also interested in the further development of cooperation with African countries in the field of energy. This cooperation is based on rich experience created in total. I want to emphasize this and draw your attention to this, dear friends. A total of a quarter of all hydropower capacities in Africa have been created. Now Russian companies are implementing new mutually beneficial projects aimed at meeting the growing needs of the African economy in fuel and generating capacity to ensure Africans access to an inexpensive and reliable, sustainable and environmentally friendly source of energy in varying degrees of development. More than 30 promising energy projects with Russian participation in 16 countries are currently being developed. Of projects is about 370 gigawatts over the past 2 years. Exports of Russian crude oil to Africa, oil products, liquefied natural gas have increased by 2.6 times. Viktorovich, energy is one of your favorite topics. Your assessment of the prospects for Russian-African energy cooperation. In my opinion, there are great prospects in Russia. Why? Because Russia has a competitive advantage in 2 areas, nuclear energy and hydropower. Why they're important? They're important today in the context of the so-called fourth energy transition or green energy transition, and this means that Russia is ready to offer American countries not only cheap, but also green, clean energy that is not needed. Refuse the prospect of the next decades, and as the President of Russia said, life is such a rich, successful history of cooperation with African countries, and in the energy sector it is not only the Suvan Dam that was launched in '64. There are many other examples, and I think that the Africans, they remember this very well and know and hope with regard to the West. The West only puts pressure on everyone and demands to move along this green agenda, but it doesn't offer anything, including to African countries, and Russia says less. But as we heard from the President, dozens of specific projects that are the most foreseeable immediate prospects. Green, cheap energy materializes what Africa needs for development, and I believe that this will create a so-called synergistic effect. Other sectors of the industry will reach out for energy, and this will enrich both Russia and Africa. I think this topic of green energy once again emphasizes the fundamental difference in Russian policy and policy of the West, because the West promotes its approach, creates competitive advantages for itself and imposes on other countries deliberately bad conditions for them that reduce their competitiveness, and Russia creates and strengthens the competitiveness of African countries by solving their problems, including in the field of green energy. Well, of course, one more extremely important, the direction of Russian-African cooperation is security. Africa is still not devoid of conflicts. They continue there. Here is a good example. By the way, the coup d'etat is taking place right before our eyes in Nigeria, where the president was actually overthrown, by the way. Africa has already condemned this coup d'etat. Condemned Africa, the European Union, Russia urged all parties to observe to avoid violence and try resolve the situation through negotiations, but this just underscores the need for Russia to continue to provide significant security assistance to African countries. Algeria is one of the key importers of Russian military equipment, but beyond that, Russia is doing a lot of things. Ivan Pavlovich, this is exclusively your area of expertise, since you evaluate the prospects of our cooperation in the field of security. I would note that he said the general turn towards Africa was precisely on the system of military technical cooperation. Since earlier, of course, African countries were, let's say, on the margins of the military technical cooperation due to many circumstances, but there was a serious turnaround, and now we can note, for example, that defense exports, our single supplier of weapons and equipment, has concluded 150 contracts of various different types since 2019 for $10 billion. That is, $10 billion is put in the portfolio of orders. If you mentioned Algeria, which buys significant amounts of our weapons of military equipment to Egypt, including, for example, South Africa is a country that is self-sufficient in this regard. Its military-industrial complex has been developed since the days of Proteid, and they produce many systems that are nuclear state, which, by the way, and we are interested in, the Africans at one time were just transferred to the advanced positions, were developed, and the brother system, that is, reinforced protection of mine protection, and we somehow also perceive these developments, well, with, on the other hand, Africans, most countries are interested in, for example, our helicopters, equipment, our vehicles, and in the military version, small arms. There are countries such as Uganda, for example. She surprised everyone all the time. Not so big, not so big rich country, but she bought modern T-90 tanks from us and modern fighters. Therefore, the potential here is huge. And the most important thing is that countries are different, and with different countries we can some way just deliver, some way joint development, including joint development, such as with South Africa, and, by the way, we open our helicopter center there, including one more example of an equal employee, of course, are we also have developments to ensure security for different countries. You know, the Central African Republic, Maliba, Cinema, Faso, we have an agreement with the court regarding the opening of our Navy at forward bases in Russia. It's true that the events there are generally so ambiguous, but nevertheless the situation persists. I think that everything will be implemented. So in this regard, I would also note that when the Americans created the African Command, not a single country in Africa accepted the headquarters. This is in Africa and there in Europe. It was very significant, unlike Russia and China, which are also quite free to operate and develop both military technical cooperation and military cooperation with countries. Thank you very much for giving this example. Indeed, the United States is planning to conduct actions anywhere in the world. They have commands that actually are responsible for the entire surface of the globe, but this American planning brings instability, yes, and undermines security. The activities of the same African Committee in relation to Africa are Already negative in Africa, they're waiting and welcoming to pay attention to Africans driving. The French out of the moth. France has gone to Russia their welcome chat. Central African Republic sings because we're not only engaged in the supply of weapons of military equipment, but we are forming security institutions. We are strengthening the security of African countries from within by forming appropriate institutions, and this activity will continue, will not go anywhere. Now we will stop for a short advertisement and then we will continue. Music. The big game is on the air, one of the top priority issues for African countries at this summit. One of the main competitive advantages of Russia is indeed the question, where do we fully converge, where we are complementary with African countries, is of course food, because Russia, one of the main exporters of food products in the world, Africa in need of food. The president already said in his speech that Russia supplies free of charge and gave certain figures. How much Russia is ready to supply food products for free to the most needy African countries. But listen to what the president said in general about the potential of Russian-African cooperation in the field of food last year. Between Russia and African countries increased by 10% and amounted to $6.7 billion, and in January to June of this year it has already increased by another 60% of grain. Russia exported 11.5 million tons to Africa in 2022. And in the first 6 months, only in the first 6 months of this year, almost 10 million tons, and this despite the illegal sanctions imposed on our exports, which seriously impede the supply of Russian food, complicate transportation, logistics, insurance, and bank payments.
Екатерина Яковлевна, вот действительно продовольствие, казалось бы, самая гуманитарная область. Тем не менее,
imposes a sanction how much they really influence, and is Russia able to actually fulfill what the president says to replace Ukrainian grain, solve the problems of food security of African countries despite the ongoing sanctions policy of the West? Russia is certainly capable of fulfilling the obligations that our president gives. It's another matter that comes, they will have to be fulfilled. Say so. It will be more difficult to do it in a somewhat roundabout way than it could be implemented in the absence of sanctions. You absolutely correctly noted the sanctions that food security is one of the key humanitarian issues that, in principle, should be exempted from any sanctions regimes as such, regardless of the objection pressure. But you understand what the West is doing now. Any supply, regardless of the nature of the product, regardless of whether it is food or non-food. This fertilizer is not a whole ecosystem of various transactions, and what the West is doing. In fact, the West can even formally recognize the humanitarian nature of this issue limits everything related to these transactions, additional transactions, insurance, financial transfers, payments for relevant transactions hinder purchases and technologies, for example, for the development of agricultural engineering, and so on and so forth. Of course, all this has a very serious impact on the nature of food security, but nevertheless, we have channels for fulfilling these promises and opportunities financially in order to take on some of the additional objective ones. Unfortunately, the existing sanctions costs we also retain. We actually see it in practice, because recently an unexpected article was published by Bloomberg, where they were really surprised. In a moth, a batch of Russian grain worth 50,000 tons was delivered here, despite all Western restrictions. Nevertheless, it has the ability to actually deliver grain and other food products to them, of course, if they're not blocked in Western posts, but also in ports. But the President and Minister of Foreign Affairs say that Russia will continue to deal with the unblocking together with the United Nations. Well, what is not blocked is that ours, we, of course, will supply African countries, but where is the food? Where is the delivery? of food to the African continent, there, of course, are transport and logistics issues, and transport logistics is another priority of Russian policy towards Africa, and as Vladimir Putin emphasized, our strategic priority is to connect the North-South corridor, which is focused on the exit to the Indian Ocean with Africa. Listen to ensure the connection of the North-South transport corridor with Africa, launch of regular shipping cargo lines. The coast would be a good deed and a good start. This is joint work. Ensuring a wider coverage of the African continent by direct flights, we consider it very important to participate in the development of the African railway network. These are the urgent tasks on which we invite our African friends to work together well. The purpose of all this work is to ensure this, on the one hand, the exit of Russian goods to the Persian Gulf region, to the Indian Ocean, and further to Africa, and African goods back to Russia. Andrei Andreevich, don't you think that from a geopolitical point of view, we are actually talking about the consolidation of not only fantasy, but Eurasia and Africa, and about the interconnectedness of the world majority, that if the West is pursuing a policy of fragmentation, then we are conducting a new globalization with the Africans. We emphasize a new interconnectedness, but not like the West does, but on a purely equal other multipolar. If you want, Dmitry, this is a wonderful image. And transport is undoubtedly one of the main such fundamental infrastructure projects that Russia can now offer not only to Africa, but also to strange participants in the North-South corridor.
Российская транспортная отрасль, может быть, до конца многие этого не осознают, является одним из чемпионов преодоления нашей страной вот этого грандиозного западного давления на нашу экономику. То, в какие сроки, как оперативно
the industry was able to reorient traffic flows from the
транспортные потоки с юга
southwest to the east, to the south-north, and to the Chinese direction without significant
на китайское направление, без существенных
costs. Well, how do our rail and
работают и железнодорожные и
air transport networks work? What kind of expertise in the digitalization of all transport has accumulated in our country is undoubtedly one of such abilities of such resources that we are capable of to share, thereby strengthening the sovereignty of the countries participating in cooperation with us. It is very much in demand, as in Iran, where there are reserves for investing in the transport industry. We still have to join the railway networks with each other and help our colleagues establish transport containers, transit containers of other important goods, bulk, liquid cargo, and other ideas which Vladimir Vladimirovich proposed today in St. Petersburg on the creation of a Russian port on the east coast of Africa. Absolutely advanced. It can be compared with the Soviet project to create the Ottoman Dam if this idea is supplemented with assistance in the development of the railway network in Africa, which would allow the transport of goods to this part of the African continent and then to deliver them by sea further to the north and in the opposite direction. This would undoubtedly become one of the strategic fundamental Russian proposals of Russian projects for projects of Russia's presence in Africa, and I absolutely agree with you. This will allow us to connect the two continents with such an absolutely inseparable communication network in all areas. Transport competence that our country has accumulated here will be absolutely paramount and not on a hegemonic basis, as interconnectedness usually promotes the West and the Western model of globalization on an absolutely equal basis. But Vladimir Putin has already said today, and I emphasize this, that Russia is interested in strengthening the African Union as the main regional international organization of Africa, as the voice of Africa in the world, as the structure that actually reflects this common denominator of Africa's position. For this, Russia is helping the African Union to become a member of the G20. Huge injustice. The European Union is a member of the G20. African Union, where 1.5 billion people, where there's a growing market, for some reason it is not a member of the G20. By the way, about how unfairly the current system of global governance is arranged. But in addition, Russia is ready to share even its own competencies in terms of deepening regional integration. Listen to what Vladimir Putin said On this subject, how Russia can use and share the experience of the Eurasian Economic Union to promote the African Union. We are in favor of establishing cooperation between the Eurasian Economic Union as the largest integration project in which Russia and the African Continental Free Trade Area, formed within the framework of the African Union, are also ready to share with African partners and non-traditional experience through the Union State of Russia and by Belarus. We mean to offer our African partners our developments on such important integration issues as the removal of restrictions within the framework of the single market, the functioning of free trade zones, the implementation of a coordinated agricultural, industrial and other sectoral policy, Ekaterina Yakovleva, in addition to strengthening the subjectivity of the African Union and what the President is talking about. I think it will create a multiplicative effect in terms of economic cooperation between a correspondingly stronger integrated African Union. Certainly economies of scale, potential economies of scale in the face given the consumer potential of the region and infrastructural potential, the investment potential of the region. Formal lack of progress. It has a fairly broad agenda, that is, African countries opposing a number of issues in all areas, both monetary cooperation and financial cooperation and industrial, technological cooperation, and this is just the very opportunity that will allow building such a flexible multi-level format of interaction, including with Eurasian Economic Union, creating additional opportunities, opening additional advantages. Well, today a very big contribution was made to the formation of a multipolar world and a consolidation of the world majority, and we are now giving the word to the news, and the big game will return at 11 p.m.